You know, throughout video games there always seems to be enemies and obstacles that can pop up in any game no matter what. Stuff like zombies and aliens being able to be brought into any setting, or more specific stuff like orcs and goblins. Not to say it's a bad thing to use something so common, but you gotta be pretty creative with how you use them in your setting in order to make them stand out. You can adapt them to different genres and settings while sticking to the core idea, but sometimes it's hard to branch out unless you're doing something really out there that breaks the mold. And even then, does it really fit into that archetype you wanted it to? There's one classification of video game enemies though that I think hits that sweet spot of being both iconic and awesome to use, and it just hits every time. The skeleton, I think, represents the best of these qualities, and are honestly the most adaptable archetype for enemy designs. And while I'm not going to give you an entire history lesson on skeletons in video games, I want to tell you about how some of my favorites appear and how the creators ended up doing something right. You see, to me, what makes a good skeleton enemy can be described as sort of like a skeleton itself. Many parts that come together to make a whole unique thing. Different aspects that when combined shows off the creativity and power of what a pile of bones can really do. Apart from being really cool environmental storytelling or fun stuff with characters on the sidelines, skeletons have a lot of cool stuff about them that puts them over most enemies you might find. Skeletons are easy to implement in almost any setting a game is in. It doesn't even have to be a scary horror game. You got a medieval fantasy game? Boom, put in a skeleton warrior. A futuristic sci-fi game? Have a robotic skeleton. They don't even have to be human skeletons. You can have weird bony animals, giant masses of bones, or even just a skull can do the job. It's not hard for a human to look at something and recognize it as a skeleton, and knowing that, you can really stretch the design into something unique, yet iconic to something everybody knows. The first skeleton I ever saw in a game scared the heck out of younger me. Running around Ocarina of Time's Hyrule Field for the very first time and seeing the sunset was cool, but I didn't expect the stall children to pop up from the ground and start trying to kill me. The Zelda games have a bunch of cool recurring skeletons, like the Stalfos, which look slightly different in each game but always look like a skeleton warrior. They'll dodge your attacks and keep you on your toes and almost always reform back together, making you try different strategies like other weapons or destroying their skull to defeat them once and for all. One of the coolest bosses in the series is the Stalord from Twilight Princess. Where in the first part of its fight you gotta break its spine by bouncing off skeletal soldiers with your spinner. And that's one of the things I like about skeletons. They're super satisfying to break apart and destroy. Look at the clears from the Serious Sam series. Being outnumbered by a bunch of these guys doesn't matter because shooting them with the super shotgun or minigun and watching them scatter into a million pieces is so much fun. Binary Domain's robotic soldier grunts can have their own limbs blown off if you can aim right, revealing the internals underneath. And the Sargasso skulls from Devil May Cry are also fun to break apart with every weapon you got, from taking off chunks with your shotgun to slicing off pieces with your sword. Although not every skeleton in video games is going to let you stand by and turn them into a powdery cloud of bone. In the Castlevania series, nearly every game has some types of skeletons in them, and they all vary real differently. Armored skeletons with different weapons and attacks, huge skeletons, skeletons that run straight at you, ones that ride motorcycles, the list goes on. Some classic mainstays are the Bone Pillars, made up of dinosaur heads stacked on top of each other that spew fire. The Bone Dragon that bobs and weaves and also shoots fire at you. And of course you can't forget the all-time classic Bone Chuckin' Bros. The cool thing about how Castlevania handles skeletons is that each game can sometimes put its own spin on the design, while keeping it cool but also a little goofy if it wants. Rondo of Blood has cool regular skeletons that straight up swing on bone ropes, and a whole range of skeletons that use different weapons from boomerangs to barrels. Symphony of the Night has these weird little crawling skulls that walk along the walls and ceilings, leaking poison drool on you. Harmony of Dissonance has skeletons that mimic Simon Belmont, weird lab skeletons and test tubes, and whatever this guy is. Aria of Sorrow has a variation of giant skeletons called Creaking Skull, a huge skeleton whose lower body is destroyed and drags along the ground trying to crush you with its giant femur, or burn you with its fireballs. Creaking Skull itself is based on the Japanese yokai Gashudokuro, and while the Creaking Skull doesn't bite your head off and drink your spraying blood like Gashudokuro are said to do, it's really neat to see a piece of Japanese folklore inside Dracula's castle. Especially since there's more Western folklore that a lot of people are a bit more familiar with, like werewolves and zombies and the like. But nothing can top the skeleton that's been in nearly every game. Big Daddy Death himself. Death is always one of Dracula's #1 homies and is a recurring boss who switches up both how he looks and how he fights in every appearance. He may want to fight you in a one-on-one battle in a humanoid form, or break down and transform into an awesome second phase that's always fun to figure out and deal with. Castlevania isn't the only series to have folkloric skeletons, though. Shin Megami Tensei and Persona have their own demons and characters based on myths and legends, and nearly every demon that falls under the race of a fiend is a skeleton of some sort. It's an awesome blend of skeletal mythology from around the world, from the highest-ranking Buddhist monks with Daisojo, to English serial killers with Jack the Ripper, and even the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse represented by the Four Riders. It's really cool to see different types of skeletons come together, especially from different cultures. Having a variety of skeletons in your games is always a plus, because that guarantees at least some showcase of creativity, because combining neat ideas and gameplay concepts can have a great lasting impression on the player. And I think there's one game that does it pretty darn well. In Dark Souls, past the graveyard, tucked away deep underground, lies the catacombs. As you can imagine, this place has a bunch of skeletons. You get your warriors and archers, but things start to get a bit weird as you make your way deeper. You start seeing things like wheel skeletons that jump out at you as soon as you get to the lowest level. And that's only a taste of what's to come, because beyond the catacombs lies one of my favorite areas in the game. Far below ground, you can't see a dang thing except for a twinkle off in the distance. These twinkles belong to the eyes of giant skeletons. These guys line the dark cave corridors waiting to scare the living dookie out of you. And why shouldn't they? After all, you're in the tomb of the giants. This dark, decrepit area is littered with bones of all types. Even giant skeleton dogs that chase you down while you get pelted by giant skeleton archers. Once you finally get comfortable with the darkness, maybe grab a lantern and fight your way to the next bonfire, you get confronted by giant bone towers, made up of amalgamations of different bones. Not only are they gonna try to spin into you, but they can straight up slam down on you if you get too close. After these guys, you gotta wade through a sea of baby skeletons that just spawn endlessly, as you fight your way to the fog gate and get to the big boss of the tomb, Gravelord Nito. Nito is made up of a crazy amount of skeletal remains, and summons as many homies as he can in order to take you down. He's the Lord of Death, so naturally he's going to do everything he can to kill you, even if it means using a giant wave of darkness that scatters his own goons into pieces. Along with his haunting screams and tricky attacks, it all makes for a cramped and creepy fight. Other FromSoft games have cool skeletons as well, like High Lord Wolnir from Dark Souls 3. Elden Ring even has the Tibia Mariners, which summon skeletons of all types to fight you, along with a bunch of skeletons in crypts and graveyards from around the world. From warriors and mages to bones of giants that shoot magic beams at you, I'd say FromSoft knows how to handle the skeletons pretty well. Skeletons just kind of work in almost any scenario. They're really only limited by the creativity of the people designing the game. It makes me real hopeful to see newer games using them in pretty creative ways, and I really hope I see more of them in the future. This video was really fun to make, since I got to see how each skeleton has its own sort of style and soul put into it by the creators. I wanted to do something a bit spooky for October, and I'm glad I got to make that happen. So sit down with a big cold glass of milk and thank the skeleton that's had your back since you were born, by playing a cool game with some cool skeletons.